Very good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Welcome to Living Prairie Museum. This is the fourth in our winter speaker series here at Living Prairie Museum. Welcome.
Thank you.
To Dr. Katherine Dearborne at Department of Environmental Science at University of Winnipeg. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Welcome, and thank you to everyone joining us live or online this chilly evening. If there are technical issues for people online, we have a webmaster, Ash Brakowski. Please give them a message via the chat box. Ash Brakowski is also chair of the board of the Friends of Living Prairie Museum. Thanks, Ash. Welcome and thank you to our ASL interpreter. We've got Nikki joining us virtually. Please note that this is a live interpretation from English to ASL, so it's not edited or pre-recorded. You'll notice that Nikki's on the screen here. And for those at home, feel free to scroll to Nikki for her ASL interpretation. Thank you to the Living Prairie Museum and the Friends of Living Prairie for hosting tonight's event. Friends of Living Prairie Museum is a nonprofit organization that supports Living Prairie. This talk is a fundraiser. There's a donation bin that we didn't. Oh yeah, it's out. Okay, very good. Thank you in advance for your kind donation. You can also donate online. This helps to support the work of Living Prairie Museum, and the donations support programs like this and the conservation, restoration, and education work that we do here at Living Prairie Museum. So thank you very much. Thank you too to the Living Prairie Museum. Living Prairie Museum is a 32-acre, 13-hectare tall grass prairie preserve. This rare ecosystem persists because Indigenous stewardship and land management practice since time immemorial have cared for this land. Concerned settlers and city administrators stand in this legacy, and we join caring for this land and loving this tall grass prairie where we live. This is Treaty 1 land. It's the home of Cree, Ojibwe, and Dakota nations. It's also the homeland of the Red River Métis. We're working together on reconciliation. Each of us has a job to do, and we're working together. Our water comes from Shoal Lake. Shoal Lake 40, the First Nation is on Treaty 3 territory. We appreciate good, clean water. Before I hand the mic over to Dr. Dearborne, you're going to have time to formulate your questions. There'll be a question and answer period. For those online, please use the chat box for your questions and comments. I'm going to read now Dr. Dearborne's bio. Dr. Dearborne completed a PhD at Queen's University in 2017 and worked as a postdoctoral fellow at Wilfrid Laurier University for 3 years before starting a position as a research associate at University of Winnipeg in 2020. Oh, that was just lockdown time.
Yeah, middle of COVID move. Yeah.
Oh, her former research investigated responses of boreal and tundra ecosystems to climate warming and permafrost thaw in the Yukon and Northwest Territories. Currently working on several local tall grass prairie habitat conservation projects in collaboration with Nature Conservancy Canada and the Assiniboine Park Conservancy. Today, she'll be speaking about some of the work she's done to help facilitate the reintroduction of the endangered Poweshiek Skipperling butterfly in the Manitoba Tall Grass Prairie Reserve. Join me in welcoming our speaker this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, lovely. Oh, I think is this one working? Or did I do this wrong? Yeah, okay. I've got one, yeah. Okay, great. Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for showing up. It's so nice to be here with some prairie enthusiasts. I have spent quite a bit of time in Southern Ontario, and as Lois was just saying, the Yukon and Northwest Territories. But I did grow up in southeastern Manitoba, and it was really lovely to move back here and get to work on prairie systems again after a lot of time spent in the boreal forest and tundra. So if I can figure out how to advance slides here. Do I use the mouse? Oh yeah, I think I do. There we go. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about one of a few different projects that I'm working on. This one focuses on the Poweshiek Skipperling, which I'll talk about in a second, and trying to facilitate its movement through patches of prairie habitat in the Manitoba Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. So I'm just going to give a little introduction to Poweshiek Skipperling. You might have heard of this butterfly. It's made the news a few times, and I know we have an avid fan of the Poweshiek Skipperling in the audience. But it has made the news a few times in recent years because it is severely endangered. I think there are possibly fewer Poweshiek Skipperling in the world than there are pandas, giant pandas. At least that's what we think. It's hard to judge their numbers, but and so my work will focus kind of on their habitat a little bit more than the butterfly themselves. But just to give you a little bit of background on the butterfly, because that does kind of will come into play a little bit later on. First of all, this butterfly, as you can see, is quite small. That's a thumbnail. So it's quite little. And it's not a very good flyer. So this is not a monarch. And not only is it not a monarch, it sometimes will not even fly over a road. And certainly will not fly through forest, not even tall cattails and things like that. It just sort of goes up to them and then it kind of goes, nope, I'm going back into the prairie. The other thing about this butterfly is that it relies on a very specific sort of set of native prairie grasses and wildflowers to survive. The caterpillars in particular are quite picky about what they eat. So these are sort of two, I know this just looks like green. It's really hard to take photos of grasses. I do have an uncle who's a specialist in it, so shout out to him. But in case it isn't obvious, this is little blue stem and this is prairie dropseed. Those are 2 of 4 species of grass that this butterfly, the caterpillars of this butterfly, are known to eat in the wild. And that's it. They really haven't been seen feeding on other species. And certainly a lot of the European species that have been seeded over the years and that are sort of have run rampant through a lot of Manitoba, it either won't eat them, or if it does, its survival rates are very low. So it kind of needs very specific grasses. The adults are a little bit less picky with respect to the types of flowers that they'll nectar on, but they do seem to prefer, again, a bit of a narrow subset of native prairie wildflowers, including things like pale spike lobelia, black-eyed Susan, etc. But again, they can nectar. They're a little bit more flexible than the caterpillars. So as I mentioned, this butterfly is severely endangered, but at one time it was incredibly abundant and it had a very, very wide geographic distribution, extending all the way from sort of southeastern Michigan, all through kind of the upper Midwestern states in the gray here with sort of its historic range, and up into Manitoba. Currently, however, it's basically collapsed to the point where there are only 2 remaining sort of sets of populations. One of them is in Michigan here, in southeastern Michigan. The other one is in Manitoba. So at the 2 sort of extreme edges of its former range, you can still find it. Up until quite recently, there were also a few of them in Wisconsin, but they seem to have petered out there and nobody's seen them there for a while now. So it seems like it's just these 2 spots left. And why is that? Well, almost certainly it's because of the sort of replacement of tallgrass prairie habitat by agricultural croplands. No surprise there. If we just look at sort of Manitoba, the original extent of tallgrass prairie habitat is in the red there. And you can see by the 1970s, very little of it left. In fact, over 99% of it was converted into agriculture, sort of cultivated croplands. And And in fact, even if you look at sort of all of the endangered species in Canada that are listed under the Federal Species at Risk Act, about a third of them are prairie species, which is kind of crazy considering prairies don't actually occupy that much of Canada's landmass, but so they're very, very overrepresented in that list of endangered species in Canada. And again, that's because the sort of replacement of their habitat by croplands is something that you don't see with really almost any other habitat type. Other habitat types have been lost to some extent, but not like over 99% the way that tallgrass prairie habitat has. And Poweshiek, of course, is one of those federally listed endangered species. So if we look at that Manitoba population for a second, it's located, so the remaining Manitoba population, which again is the only one in Canada and only one of two remaining, with that Michigan one being the other one. Where does it exist in Manitoba? Well, it exists kind of, well, not quite straight south of Winnipeg, I guess, but a bit southeast down near the US border in a network of parcels of land that have been purchased by various Manitoba conservation organizations. In particular, the Nature Conservancy of Canada and the Manitoba Habitat Heritage Corporation. So in, I think, the 1980s or so, those organizations, along with a few others, started kind of buying up lands in this area that contained sort of pristine prairie habitat. And they've built quite a nice network of parcels of land that have some prairie on them. So all these sort of little quarter sections in the pink here are owned by conservation partners of one kind or another. And you can see there's sort of a northern cluster here and then a more southern cluster. And yeah, just keep that in mind because I'll come back to that in a second. But I just wanted to point out, though, that it's not like you get sort of continuous prairie all through these pink areas. What you actually see on the ground is that the sort of tallgrass prairie habitat only exists in these little sort of patches within those quarter sections of land. Often they're separated by wetlands, by aspen stands, by shrub fields. And of course, there are private properties all in here as well that may or may not be used as rangelands, like heavily grazed rangelands or cultivated fields. So we refer to that as, or that idea of sort of these patches of habitat being separated by those other types of vegetation and other land cover types. The term for that is fragmentation, or fragmented habitat is how we kind of talk about it. So as I mentioned, the historic decline of Poweshiek skipperling is almost certainly linked to the loss of over 99% of their habitat in Manitoba and elsewhere. But interestingly and very unfortunately, they kind of started to decline after a period of sort of stability in the 1970s and 80s. They started to decline again in kind of the late 1990s. And this was happening all like in the Michigan, Wisconsin, and Manitoba populations. It sort of all happened simultaneously. And those populations that, as I say, had been relatively stable for a few decades started to crash. Not only did their numbers go down, but they started to disappear one by one from those little patches of prairie habitat that I showed before. And in particular, in our Manitoba population, we used to have about, I don't know, maybe about a dozen patches of habitat sprinkled throughout these two sort of areas of conservation-owned land. About a dozen or so, maybe a bit more than that, were occupied by Poweshiek. And then in the last few decades, just since the late 1990s, we're now down to just two little patches of prairie habitat up in this northern cluster of parcels of land that still have wild Poweshiek in them. And those two are fairly close together. They're only a few kilometers apart and very small in size, just really a few hectares in size. So that's obviously a pretty tenuous situation. Any flood or other unplanned disturbance that came through that area could wipe out the entire Canadian population in one go. So it's a little bit dire. at the moment. Um, the interesting thing, though, is that we don't really know what caused or what is causing that more recent decline, because it's not as if more prairie is being converted into croplands, right? All of the sites that they still occupy are conservation owned lands that have not been cultivated in that time. So it's not as if their habitat's been lost exactly the way it was sort of historically. So that can't be it. And there are a few hypotheses floating around that we're actively trying to address right now. It could be that climate has become somewhat unfavorable for them. We have a student investigating that possibility. It could be related to pesticide drift from neighboring croplands. We have other folks working on that. But one really, I guess maybe a leading hypothesis, is that it actually has to do with vegetation change within their habitat, within those patches of prairie. And specifically, change that's happening because of a lack of disturbance. So disturbance used to be very, very frequent in prairie systems. And in fact, in the tallgrass prairie, disturbance is really what kept it prairie. Tallgrass prairie is a little bit more moist than shortgrass prairie, for example. And so the only reason it sort of stayed open and didn't become overrun with aspen and shrubs is because there were very frequent grazing and wildfire events that kind of favored the grasses over the trees and shrubs, basically. Grasses are very well adapted to grazing and wildfire compared to trees, for example, although aspen would give them a run for their money, I think. Oh, and sorry, apologies for this crowd. This is actually very blasphemous. That's a wood bison, not a plains bison, but it's the only photo I had. Forgive me. But yeah, Poweshiek and disturbance have an interesting relationship, a little bit paradoxical, actually, because a disturbance, obviously, if a fire comes through, it will kill Poweshiek off. And the same thing with grazing. If you get a herd of bison trampling through an area, it probably would kill a bunch of them. Historically, that wasn't really an issue because you had a big open prairie, and maybe if a few of them died off in a really heavily grazed or burned area, the neighboring populations could just fill that back in, no problem. So that did not used to be an issue. And of course, that disturbance is really important in keeping prairies open. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Poweshiek cannot fly through tall shrubs or trees or even wetlands or even a gravel road. So all this to say that if you take that disturbance away, this starts to happen. Very rapidly, you get shrubs and trees moving into that open prairie. And so Poweshiek really rely on frequent disturbance, even though it can also cause mortality if you're not careful. There's two problems really when this starts to happen for the Poweshiek. One is that these large shrubs start to outcompete a lot of those grasses that the caterpillars need to feed on. The other thing, of course, as I mentioned, is that the adults are very pathetic flyers and just don't want to deal with it. I mean, I don't really want to deal with walking through that stuff either. I can't blame them, I guess. But yeah, and unfortunately, in modern prairie landscapes, I mean, it makes sense, but anytime a fire starts, someone's going to put it out because you have private properties all around these parcels of conservation lands. So you can't just let fires run rampant. And obviously there are no more bison kind of roaming the plains. You can graze with cattle, but cattle eat different things than bison sometimes and have sort of different grazing habits. So it's a little bit different. Anyway, yeah, so this lack of disturbance seems to be causing sort of tall shrubs and trees to move into their habitat. And that's one possible explanation for that, for their recent decline, the one that started in the 1990s. Well, but thankfully for the Poweshiek's sake, there are some folks working on their recovery and working very hard and very well on sort of trying to keep the Canadian population afloat. I'm going to give a shout out to two of them, the Assiniboine Park Conservancy and the Nature Conservancy of Canada. The Assiniboine Park Conservancy have started a really neat project where they've gone out to those I mentioned there were two patches of habitat that still had wild populations. The Assiniboine Park Conservancy has been going out temporarily sort of capturing wild females until they lay their eggs, and then taking those eggs back to the Assiniboine Park Zoo, waiting for them to hatch, and then raising the caterpillars over the winter in a sort of controlled, protected environment to kind of minimize mortality over the winter, because a lot of the caterpillars in the wild do die off over the winter. And then what they do is, once those caterpillars form a pupa in the spring, they take that pupa back to the same site that they were harvesting eggs from, and the butterflies hatch out of the pupa, or I don't know if hatch is the right word. Apologies for entomology folks in the room, but anyway, emerge from the pupa. I think that's the right word. They emerge from the pupa, and so that can help just sort of raise the numbers of Poweshiek within those two remaining sites. And the other thing, of course, that's probably just as important is the habitat management that the Nature Conservancy has been doing on those properties. So they've been basically trying to mimic those historic prairie disturbance regimes by using cattle in very controlled ways. They have portable fencing that they'll sort of move around to make sure that overgrazing doesn't happen and that you don't get excessive trampling. And they also do prescribed burns. These are very, very tricky to implement, obviously. You need perfect conditions. If things are too wet, the fire will be easier to control, but it won't actually do what it's supposed to do. It won't really burn off the shrubs and trees very effectively. And it'll just sprout out like crazy again the next spring. But obviously, if you have dry conditions, there's the risk of that fire spreading to people's private properties, which would be very, very bad. So that is very, very difficult to implement. The other thing that they do actually is they have really big sort of mowers, essentially, that will mow up shrubs, and that's obviously easier to implement really than either of these two things. And we're just sort of trying to figure out whether it actually does as effective a job as those two options. It's very tricky to try to mimic those historic regimes, basically, but they're doing a very good job. So the good news really is that those efforts by the Assiniboine Park Conservancy have started to pay off. They've been doing that thing where they take the eggs back to the zoo and raise the caterpillars for a number of years now, since 2018. And it certainly seems, from what we can tell with our adult butterfly surveys, the numbers have been going up since they've started doing that. So it seems to be working, which is awesome. We're also starting to plan reintroductions of individuals into some of those formerly occupied patches. So the ones where they've disappeared from in recent decades. We're thinking of taking some of the zoo-reared caterpillars or pupa, I guess, and putting them into some of the sites they used to occupy. So that we spread out all our eggs are not in one tiny little 3-kilometer radius basket, basically. But the issue is, well, there's two kind of things that are still somewhat worrying. The first is that we still don't really know why they were declining in the first place there. Again, it's not like their habitat was being lost anymore, and yet they really plummeted starting in the late 90s. So if we stop doing these reinforcements or reintroductions, chances are, if that cause is still happening, they'll just decline again, which is not exactly what we want. We want to get them to the point where they're sort of self-sustaining. The other issue, of course, is just that fragmentation I mentioned earlier. That's a really big problem in general. If you have populations that become isolated from one another because their habitat is too fragmented, and especially with a species like this that can't really disperse very far or very easily, you can get declines in genetic diversity because there's just too much inbreeding in a population. And also, again, if a disturbance comes through, there's no way for them to recolonize a disturbed site because they can't get to it. The other thing is that it just makes trying to mimic historic prairie regime or disturbance regimes very tricky, because, again, there's a risk if you do a prescribed burn in a site that's occupied by Poweshiek, you could accidentally kill too many of them. So you have to do these tiny little patch burns next to the area where we think Poweshiek are, so that hopefully they can move over, and it just becomes very, very tough. So it would be great if we could better connect their habitat somehow. And that's kind of where I came in. So I had I had some working relationships already with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and then we got together and said, let's try to sort of address some of these issues. And so I was brought on to help out with that. And I'm going to talk about sort of two lines of inquiry, I guess, that we had with this project. One was just, is the invasion of trees and shrubs into prairie patches, is that actually responsible for this recent decline in Poweshiek abundance and distribution? Can we kind of prove that somehow or try to link those things? And then the other thing that we wanted to do was just look at the present day situation, the sort of configuration of these patches of habitat right now, and try to figure out what is the best way to maybe establish some corridors so that Poweshiek can move among those patches a little more easily. So I'll start off with that first question. Is prairie fragmentation due to tree and shrub invasions responsible for this recent and ongoing Poweshiek decline? And the way that we did this, I guess there's a few ways that you can kind of measure vegetation change over time. One is if you're lucky enough that folks, back in the day went out and surveyed vegetation using just plots on the ground. They kind of looked at what was there and what abundances all those species were in. You can sometimes return to those spots, repeat their methods, and you'll get a very direct, very detailed sort of measure of how the vegetation has changed. Problem is that's only in very specific locations where they put their plots. Obviously, that doesn't help you if you want to look at a whole landscape. The other problem in our case is that the earliest sort of vegetation data that we had access to that had been collected from the fields in this area was already sort of, it was already kind of midway into the decline when those data were collected. And so what we really were looking for is a starting point from before the decline was even had started. We wanted to kind of know what the vegetation was like then so we could compare it to the present day. So to do this, I use satellite imagery, and specifically the Landsat record, which is a NASA, well, a series of NASA satellites. And there are a few different options. There's lots and lots and lots of satellites out there, obviously. Some of them can't really help you in terms of measuring aspects of the vegetation, and others can. Landsat sensors are some of the ones that can. And the reason they can is because of the specific wavelengths of light that they record. So the way that these satellites work, they're called passive sensors, is, and I'm not a physicist, so forgive me, but you may be somewhat familiar with the electromagnetic spectrum of light, right? There's a spectrum where there's visible light, and then there's types of sort of radiation that are not visible to our eyes, but still exist. So the sun emits all of those different wavelengths of light. And here I'm showing blue, green, red, and near infrared light in these different colored arrows. So the sun shines down onto a patch of prairie. And then because of the characteristics of that vegetation, different amounts of those different wavelengths are reflected back off the prairie. And that's what the satellite's recording, is the amount that's reflected. And of course, the prairie is also absorbing some of these wavelengths more than others. So what you end up getting is, let's say, a lot of near infrared light gets reflected. That's true for really any green vegetation. It tends to reflect a lot of the near infrared. And really a lot of the green, that's why vegetation shows up as green to our eyes. But maybe it absorbs a bunch of the red and the blue. And then what you can do, the way that the satellite data works, is a satellite image is composed of pixels. And in the case of a Landsat image, each pixel is 30 meters by 30 meters in size. And within that pixel, you don't just get sort of a picture of the landscape. It actually tells you the value of wavelengths of reflected light for each of those bands or wavelengths that the sensor is recording. And so the way that you can use these data really to measure vegetation change is the fact that the composition of these values is different depending what type of vegetation is on the ground or what type of vegetation makes up that pixel. So prairie vegetation is going to have different numbers for these wavelengths basically than woody vegetation. And so using that information, you can then put together what's called a classified satellite image, where for every 30 by 30 meter pixel in a huge landscape, you can figure out, okay, which of those pixels are composed of prairie vegetation and which are composed of trees or shrubs. Now, I made that sound maybe a little bit easier than it actually is in practice, but that's the idea. Tess is nodding. Yes, that's the idea. I won't get into the weeds on this, although I would love to, because it's actually a lot of fun to do, but certainly very, very tricky and requires some trial and error. But in the end, you can come up with a classified image like this one. So here we're looking again at the Manitoba Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. This is that area where Poweshiek are still found, and this is the area where they've disappeared from. And I generated a classified image for 1995, which predates their decline. And we've got sort of prairie vegetation in the light green and trees or shrubs in the dark green. I tried to separate pixels that were treed from pixels that had shrubs, and that was impossible. Because their wavelengths of reflected light were just too similar, and pixels that are 30 by, now I'm getting into the weeds, I'll stop. That's the 1995 one. And then I got another one from 2020 and classified that one as well. So if you toggle between these two, don't freeze the computer, you can see that some change happened, right? In that time. Assuming my classification is any good, which I did go out and check, and it was all right, I guess. I wasn't totally happy, but I think it was good enough for our purposes. Yeah, so that was the basic idea there. Then I went in and compared those, and I specifically looked at, okay, how much of those sort of patches of habitat, how many pixels or how much area of those patches changed from prairie to woody vegetation, and conversely, how many changed from woody vegetation to prairie vegetation, and then how many just didn't change at all. And so I was able to map that really for each of those patches of habitat in all of those parcels of conservation-owned properties in the Manitoba Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. So I came up basically with maps that represented sort of those locations of change, either prairie to woody vegetation or woody to prairie in blue, or just no change in white. And this obviously is not real data. This is just me coloring a lot of squares in PowerPoint to represent what happened there. Okay, so getting to some results of that analysis. What you're looking at here is actually, yeah, okay, just focus on sort of the left-hand panels for now. Each one of these bars represents one of those little squiggly patches of habitat within a conservation-owned parcel of land. These 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, these 7 on the top are in that northern group of patches where Poweshiek is to be found. And then these ones on the bottom here are from that more southern group of habitat patches where Poweshiek is no longer found. And on the left here with these blue bars, you're looking at the amount of land within those little patches in hectares. I apologize, I maybe should have put this in acres. I can picture acres better than hectares, which is bad. But yeah, what we're showing in basically the taller the bar here, the more land area within that habitat patch changed from woody vegetation to prairie vegetation. So it kind of did the opposite of what we are thinking is happening in a lot of cases. Then though, if you look at the red bars in these right 2 panels, that represents the amount of area in those patches that changed from prairie vegetation to woody vegetation. And right off the bat, you can see that in this southern group of habitat patches where Poweshiek has disappeared, sometimes that was a lot. And by a lot, we're looking at a little over 10 hectares of land in what is quite a small patch of habitat, often maybe 20 hectares. So it was sometimes up to 50% of of those patches had undergone a change from prairie vegetation to woody since 1995. You can see it did vary a lot among those different patches. And interestingly enough, this one here, this site 11, because the Nature Conservancy numbers all of these patches for their this one actually had over 5 hectares go from woody vegetation to prairie. And that's because the Nature Conservancy of Canada has been doing a lot of really active management to mitigate disturbance in that site. So actually some of the shrubs and trees were treated a little bit as a result of that, we think. They've successfully done quite a number of prescribed burns in that site in particular. So that's kind of interesting that that is really the one that stands out as having a lot of this blue type of change, the woody to prairie. But certainly, yeah, in some of these southern patches, there's been quite a lot of sort of invasion of trees and shrubs. Now, the other thing that I did to try to link that change to what we've seen in terms of the disappearance of Poweshiek from those patches over time is I calculated what are called correlation coefficients, and I'll describe what those are, between the amount of change that happened, the amount of vegetation change that happened in a given patch, and basically how long Poweshiek persisted in that patch until they disappeared. So all you really need to know is that if this correlation coefficient is positive, it means that that type of change is associated with longer Poweshiek persistence in those patches. They stuck around longer, they didn't disappear. If the value is negative, it means that that type of change, in this case prairie to woody, is associated with Poweshiek disappearing earlier from those patches. And you can see it definitely seems as though Poweshiek have been disappearing earlier from the patches that underwent a lot of this sort of woody invasion, so invasion of trees and shrubs. Now, these correlations were not statistically significant, meaning we can't be sure that this isn't just random chance that we got this result. So, and that was really due to the fact that we just had so few our sample size, we say, was small, which means that we just didn't have a lot of patches to test this out with. And so our statistical tools couldn't be sure that this is a real pattern. It could just have happened due to random chance. But certainly it's kind of telling and hints, at least, that this sort of woody invasion might have been responsible for their disappearance. Might have. That was as close as we came to solving the mystery of why they're undergoing this recent decline. But certainly this is maybe a piece of the puzzle, and probably what's happening is that there are a lot of factors that contributed to that decline. So it'll be interesting to see what the folks who are investigating sort of the influence of climate and pesticides, et cetera, are going to find in the next few years. But that was what we found with this. So moving on then to the second part of this study that I did, where I was trying to look at how we can improve the connectivity of those remaining patches of habitat. And again, I used some swanky spatial analysis tools to try to model this. So Tess is very excited. Excellent. I'm good. There's a landscape ecology nerd in the crowd. I realized this talk was a lot less about prairie botany, which is really what I love, and a lot more about spatial analysis. But I don't know. I love both. What can I say? So I did this I basically modeled the movement of Poweshiek through these landscapes, sort of among these different patches of habitat, in 2 different ways. I used 2 different tools to do this and then kind of compared their outputs, because these 2 tools work a little bit differently, and I was curious to see how they would compare. So the first one, well, basically both of them do somewhat of a similar thing. They both try to predict, okay, if you have what are called sources of your study organism, in our case, Poweshiek, on this little model landscape that I drew here, so those little numbered circles. If we imagine that our study organism, or Poweshiek in this case, it, it's emanating directions from these source populations at all time. It takes that information and then combines that with what's called a resistance surface that you make yourself, that you kind of feed to it. And that resistance surface is basically a representation of how easy or hard it is for your study organism to move through a landscape from one source to another. Basically, your model organisms are trying to get between these patches of habitat, and you're basically telling the computer, okay, these are areas where it's quite easy for that organism to move in the darker green here, and then maybe the lighter colors, the sort of white colors. You can also introduce out and out barriers to movement to this little model and tell it, okay, a Poweshiek absolutely cannot move through this white area no matter what. It kind of can move through this sort of pale area down here, but it's going to really struggle. And then in this dark green area, oh yeah, that's like a highway. They just travel along there super fast and really easily. So that's the kind of data that you feed into a least cost path or a circuit theory model, essentially. And then it will sort of tell you, well, not to get ahead of myself, least cost paths, which is one of the two sort of modeling approaches that I used, will generate, kind of what the name suggests, a set of routes or lines that connect these source populations in your landscape. And it will basically find the path of least resistance between any given pair of patches for your study organism using that information that you give it, the sources and the resistance surface. And then it'll also tell you basically the cost of travel for your organism along those paths. And that cost of travel is a function of the distance that the organism has to go to get between the patch, as well as how resistant the surface is to movement along that path. So it's a function of both of those two things. So that's very useful. You can see how this could be quite useful in figuring out how to establish sort of corridors that the organism can use to travel between those patches. But the one, I don't know if it's a downside, but the one thing you have to keep in mind with least cost path analysis is that it doesn't actually take into account the fact that there might be alternate routes that your individual organism can use to get between a given pair of patches. Because if that's the case, then let's say between sort of patches 2 and 3 here, there's actually a bunch of other ways the organism could get there. You would think, looking at this output, that, oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. The thinner lines represent harder to move. Okay, so if you're traveling between patch 1 and 2, according to the least cost path analysis, that might be a very difficult road to travel if you're a Poweshiek. Or did I get that wrong? That's the easy one, right? Okay, so I was right the first time. The thick lines are the tough ones. Yes, because that's got a more resistant surface. Yeah, okay. So if you're trying to travel between patch 2 and 3 as a Poweshiek, the least cost path output might kind of indicate that that's unlikely that a Poweshiek would actually make that journey, because it's got a high it's still the best route connecting those patches, but it's got a high cost to it. It's a long distance and it's tough going for the Poweshiek. But if there's a lot of other ways that the Poweshiek can get between 2 and 3, then even if they're difficult to traverse, it might make it there more often than not, just because of sheer redundancy. There's just a bunch of different ways it can get there. So least cost path analysis doesn't quite get at that as much. It just sort of tells you these are the best ways to go. So to kind of get at that a little bit more, you can use what's called circuit theory, which I ended up reading up a bunch on electrical circuits because that is what this is based on, believe it or not. Again, not being a physicist, that was a challenge for me, but I'll try to explain it. So what this does is it takes those alternate routes into account when it's trying to, and what it will do is generate a map that shows effectively the density of these hypothetical organisms at any point in your landscape. And what it's done to generate that map is it's figured out all the alternate routes that your Poweshiek could take to get between those source populations. And if with the thinking that if there are very few alternate routes, if it kind of go one way to get between one patch and another, that'll force more individuals through a smaller area, and the density of them, or the current, I guess, in electrical terms, will be higher. So those areas are actually really, really important in terms of maintaining connectivity on the landscape, because it's the only viable way for Poweshiek to get from point A to point B. They're going to get kind of funneled through a smaller area. And so that smaller area, you really need to make sure you prioritize that area when you're establishing these connective corridors. Because again, there's just a lack of alternate routes for them to take. And those areas are termed pinch points. I don't think that has any roots in electrical conductivity theory. That's more a ecologist term, I guess. But yeah, it will basically make a map of the density of these hypothetical Poweshiek moving between their source populations. So to actually run these analyses, I fortunately had access to some pretty cool data that's been collected over time. First of all, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, as I mentioned earlier, has actually gone out in the field and sort of mapped all of these patches of habitat in very detailed ways. They've actually sort of walked around the perimeters. They've mapped all the different vegetation types that are in their parcels of land. And they supplied those data to me, and I was able to basically outline patches of Poweshiek habitat with quite good accuracy. So I used those as my source populations in these models, basically. And the idea being that really these are, basically you can picture these source populations, the way that they function in these models, it's as if Poweshiek are just being spewed in all directions from these source populations at all times. So that's what I used for the sources. And then I came up with a resistance surface for Poweshiek that's kind of based on a combination of people's just observations when they've sort of been out there looking at the adults flying around, in terms of sort of what kinds of surfaces are harder or easier for Poweshiek to move through. We know, for example, that obviously they can move very well through open prairie. They really, really struggle with trees or shrubs once they get past a certain threshold. Usually, I don't know, around maybe, 30 or 40% cover of trees and shrubs, it starts to get very rare to see a Poweshiek fly through that. So presumably they really don't fit when it gets that shrubby, and neither do I. I can sympathize. And they don't really fly into croplands at all, from what we've seen. So I actually made those out and out barriers. Like, they just will not enter those. I don't know, we don't really know why, but they won't. They certainly won't go into a full-on forest, like an aspen stand. And there are lots of those there. So I made those an out and out barrier as well. Wetlands, that's tricky because it kind of depends on the type of wetland. But generally, wetlands are pretty tough slogging for them. Again, because of the sort of taller cattails and stuff like that. So I made those quite high resistance in my resistance surface. And so, yeah, this is just an example of a little part of the resistance surface that I generated, with sort of the darker red areas being areas of higher resistance, either wetlands or maybe more shrub cover or something like that. And then the sort of lighter red being areas of lower resistance, so areas where Poweshiek can move more freely, with the gray areas being those barriers, so forest stands or croplands. The other thing I should say that I made a barrier was non-conservation owned properties. And the reason I did that, so basically any private property got made into a barrier. And the reason I did that is because we have no control over the management, obviously, on those private properties. So we don't want to rely on private properties to help facilitate the movement of Poweshiek through these landscapes, because we yeah, it's quite possible a landowner would be like, no, you can't cut a giant swath through my land and make it into a native prairie. Or even if they did, they could sell the land and etc. So I made those barriers as well. Although I did actually run this both ways. Anyway, no, we won't get into that. And then what I did is I ran that least cost path analysis and came up with a bunch of paths connecting all the little patches of Poweshiek habitat in those two areas, the northern and the southern area of the Tallgrass Prairie Reserve. Color coded here according to their cost. Again, the cost of travel, which is a function of the distance and the resistance, the accumulated resistance. So I did that. And basically what I found, interestingly enough, is that in this northern group of patches, where they still exist, the cost of travel was higher even when the distance of the path was the same as it was in the southern area, meaning that they're just the surfaces in this northern area are actually more resistant on average to Poweshiek travel than they are in the southern one. Which is a bit of a concern because, again, the only two remaining patches are in this northern area. So it'd be good to try to improve that a little bit. And then, as I mentioned, I also ran that circuit theory analysis that sort of allows you to prioritize those pinch point areas and make sure that those remain sort of as connective corridors as much as you possibly can, because there are just no alternate routes for Poweshiek to take. And so in this map, basically the darker pink areas are more kind of pinch pointy, and the lighter pink areas, there's lower density of those hypothetical Poweshiek, meaning they're more spread out. It's not as important to make sure that those areas remain kind of open prairie. It's more important to kind of focus on those darker pink areas. And taking all of that together, we sat down with the Nature Conservancy of Canada over like I don't know, 3 hours or something. Multiple meetings over the course of doing all this work. And then I recently sort of presented these results to them. We sat down and kind of came up with a prioritized list of management actions that they're going to be taking in the next few years to try to improve connectivity among these patches. So that you don't need to obviously worry about the contents of this, but just to show you that we came up with sort of 6 preliminary actions numbered according to priority that we want to take to try to improve connectivity for Poweshiek in this area. You'll notice that there are a couple of caveats that we kind of threw in here. One is there is always the possibility of the Nature Conservancy acquiring more properties if there's a really good reason to. So let's say one of those pinch points fell on a private property that's neighboring some of their properties that they own. We could look to coming up with an easement with the property owner whereby they would let us sort of go in and manage that property. Or the Nature Conservancy of Canada at some point in the future might be in a position where they'd be able to purchase property. And you can see our sort of 6th most important action would require the acquisition of more property. The other thing, the other caveat we kind of built into this table is whether this corridor, this proposed corridor this proposed action would assume that Poweshiek can actually, I guess to back up a little bit, those corridors are all fine and good, but if Poweshiek can't actually make that journey, like it's just not a strong enough flyer to be able to make it, then obviously it's not really worth it to establish that corridor. Although it is quite possible that if that corridor contained really, really good habitat, maybe one generation of adults would not be able to make the full trip from one patch to another. But if the corridor itself is really great habitat, it's possible that over 2 or 3 generations, you could get individuals moving from one patch to another. So it would just take a little bit longer maybe. But yeah, we kind of built that into this table, and we just met last week actually to discuss what we're going to do this summer in terms of trying to tackle this list. So it's a work in progress, but we're making a little bit of headway. Um, and I've got some plans for this summer as well, and for some more kind of tinkering with the models. The first thing I want to do in the short term is play around with different ways of incorporating roads into those models, because that is something I really struggled to do and ended up not doing for this iteration of them, because there's some evidence. I mentioned Poweshiek really struggled to fly over roads, particularly over big paved highways. But there is some evidence. I mean, you might have noticed this yourself. Often the ditches along a mile road contain really awesome prairie habitat. And certainly when Poweshiek were more abundant, folks were seeing them fly through ditches. The problem is there are no spatial data sets that tell you that there's native prairie next to a ditch instead of a bunch of cattails. So I really couldn't incorporate that into the model because I didn't know whether to make ditches good or bad, really. um, and I tried both ways, and the results were just confusing, and I don't know. But what I want to do is maybe explore ways of at least mapping broad vegetation types in the ditches along some of the roads that intersect some of those least cost paths, maybe, or areas that are in like roads that are near pinch points, and just try to figure out from the ground whether those are sort of good ditches or bad ditches, basically. The other thing I want to do this summer, and I might regret wanting to do this, is walk along some of those routes, like walk into the pinch points or along the least cost paths and see what's actually there. Because if we want to establish a corridor, um, doing that, if there's sort of, 1 centimeter diameter aspen or shrubs, is going to require different physical equipment on the Nature Conservancy's part than, say, a gigantic aspen forest. And in fact, the forest might not even be feasible anyway, because, even if you cut those trees down and tried to encourage native prairie to regrow there, that might be a losing battle anyway. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of doing. We jokingly suggested that I would just wander around with a GoPro strapped to my head. Might work. I don't know. We're also pondering the possibility of maybe using a drone. We've got some leads on a drone with a drone pilot who would make my life a lot easier, because I think I'm going to need some serious hip waders, among other things, to do this. But anyways, we'll see how it goes. And then in the longer term, we really want to try to get more at that issue. We don't really actually know how far Poweshiek adult butterflies can fly. I mean, it does depend on what that land surface is, but all we really have are observations of folks who have gone out and surveyed those adult populations over the years. But nope, I mean, it's very, very hard to actually kind of follow a Poweshiek around for any length of time. They kind of disappear into the grass and then they reappear, and you don't know if it's the same one that you were seeing before. And it's very, very tricky. But we do have plans for either this summer or next summer. When the Assiniboine Park Conservancy folks release those captively reared at pupa, they actually mark the adult butterflies just with a Sharpie, believe it or not, so that they can tell how far those released adults have flown. So after they release them, then they'll go out and wander around and wait till they see a marked adult, and then they'll know, oh, that's one of the ones we released, so that they can distinguish it from the wild ones. That's the reason we've been doing it up till now. But we do kind of think, we've been discussing plans to use the individuals they release this summer, because if they're doing the marking anyway, maybe we can establish a bit more of a robust sampling procedure where we actually do look a little bit more in a little bit more of a robust, systematic way at how far these adults can fly, and how that depends on what they're trying to fly through, basically. Because that'll, again, allow us to figure out whether some of these longer corridors are even worth looking at or not. And just figure out sort of the feasibility of establishing even the shorter ones. So yeah, those are the plans. And with that, I do want to thank all of you for showing up tonight and for loving prairies as much or possibly more than I do. I don't know if that's possible. It probably is. It would be tough, but and then everyone at the Nature Conservancy of Canada has been a joy to work with. Same thing with the Assiniboine Park Conservancy folks. Jessica Jasso really, really helped me out a lot with the satellite image archive that I cut down to like 3 slides. I'm sorry, Jessica. She spent a lot of time combing through the image archive. And then the various sort of funding organizations. So My Tax is a federal grant that supported this work. And the Nature Conservancy of Canada also supplied money for this, and the University of Winnipeg. So, and thank you all again for coming tonight. This was a pleasure. Oh, and yeah, if anyone has any questions, I would love to take them. Yes. Oh, I think we have a mic roving around.
Yeah. You put a question? Oh, there we go.
Thanks. What evidence did you find for or against increased predation as a possible cause in Poweshiek decline?
So I just mentioned Jessica. So she is a PhD student working with us right now, and she is deep in the weeds of doing exactly that. We really have no idea. This is all brand new. Again, there's been the odd casual observation of predation by bird. Well, we know that birds are usually generalists in terms of they'll just eat whatever caterpillar they see. So it's quite possible that birds are a significant predator. There are other insect predators, obviously, as well. And again, there have been the odd observation in the States or Canada where someone has seen a predation event. But we don't know anything about the frequency of that or how whether that's changed over time or anything to do with that. And so Jessica has actually been looking at these sort of Canadian populations and documenting how many birds are in those sites that could reasonably eat a Poweshiek caterpillar, as well as the other insects that could be feeding on them. She's done like little pit traps and stuff to try to get a sense of their abundances, not only in the 2 remaining occupied sites, but in some of the unoccupied ones as well, the ones where they've disappeared from. So the jury's out. We really don't know. It's a great question, and Jessica is the person to talk to about that. Yeah.
Parasitic infections?
That's another great question. That we've done, I guess the Americans have done maybe a teensy bit more work on that, but also very much an unknown. Yeah, well, the parasites in particular are unknown. There are cases where there have been bacterial infections that have been known to affect the populations a little bit. Specifically, Wolbachia is the name of the genus of the bacteria that can infect them. And the zoo is keeping, like the Assiniboine Park Conservancy is keeping close tabs on their captive population to see. They've been sort of DNA barcoding the Wolbachia strains that are present on those captive individuals and keeping very close track of that. It doesn't seem to really cause a lot of mortality, though, that we can tell. But you're right, there very well could be other parasites at work that we just don't know about. Yeah.
Are there plans to build larger sites along those corridors, like at the pinch points, rather than just building a corridor? Because it gets like a lot of thoroughfare from the Poweshieks. Is it worth it to build like just a larger site for them to survive rather than just a corridor to get to other sites?
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually something that came up at our meeting last week. There's one spot in particular that used to be fairly open prairie that's right between those 2 remaining patches that have the wild populations. And of course, we're looking to establish a corridor that could connect those 2. But we would also really like to widen that patch that's sort of in the middle, so that even if one generation of adults can't make the trip, because it is 2 kilometers, God forbid, how she can fly 2 kilometers, there would be a bit of a spot, a little sort of refuge in between kind of thing. So yes, you're absolutely bang on. That's something that came up at our meeting last week. Yeah.
Do we have questions from?
We do. Is it possible there are diseases or viruses that have been affecting the populations of Poweshiek?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So very possible. And the shorter answer is we really don't know at this point. Yeah.
that's it online.
I think we had a couple more.
I guess I've got two questions. The Head Starting program that the DO is doing, are they just reintroducing in that more northern patch?
Well, up till last year, yes, that's all they'd been doing.
Okay.
Last year, we actually tried our first reintroduction into a formerly occupied patch.
Yeah, I was just curious, I guess, about if you think there would be a benefit to kind of working in that more southern patch where there seems to be less resistance, things like that.
Yeah, and actually, back before this decline started, that southern area had way higher numbers. Like they seemed much happier down there than they did up in the northern area. That just always seemed to be the case in like the 80s when there were Poweshiek everywhere compared to now. And yeah, that is where we tried a reintroduction attempt, was in that southern area, in part, well, mainly because we just wanted, yeah, there's always a debate with doing a reintroduction as to whether you do one close to the existing wild population so that you might get genetic exchange going, or whether you separate them so that if a disturbance wipes out one, you still have the other. And we opted for that sort of rationale. So we put them into a patch in that southern area. Yeah. And who knows if they survive the winter? We'll find out in a few months, I guess. Fingers crossed.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Just a question about overwintering.
Mm.
Is there a difference between overwintering with the tame populations and the wild?
In terms of survival?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, from what we can tell, the survival over the winter in the captive population is quite high. I think usually about, oh, I always forget because they calculate mortality for each sort of different stage, but I think it's in the nature of like 70% from egg to, I think from egg to adult when they do them captively, which we don't actually really, again, we don't know much about the survival rates in the wild, but from everything we can tell, it's a lot lower than that in the wild.
So when you have mortality in the wild, you're not sure at what stage, right?
No,
Yeah.
we think it is mainly in the larval stage.
Okay.
So that's why that sort of overwintering them at the zoo is so helpful. But we really don't know for sure. Yeah.
Well, thank goodness that they don't have to migrate over long distances like the monarch.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and I just realized, so before we go to the next question, I completely forgot to give a shout out to these folks at the Living Prairie Museum for raising the grasses that those captive caterpillars eat all winter. So yeah, those are some of them right there. That is Sporobolus heterolepis, otherwise known as prairie dropseed. Yeah. Really hard to grow. So thank you very much to these folks for doing that. That's a critical part of this puzzle for sure.
Yeah, I hope this isn't a stupid question, but
Not at
is
all.
there, we don't know. I was just wondering. Well, I just think it's just wonderful, how much that you're doing for them. That makes me very, very happy.
Oh.
And I was just wondering if there's anything that we can do.
Oh, yeah, that's such a good question. And this is something, again, that we've discussed a lot with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, because it is so tough with this stuff for the public to contribute in any way, because it really is, there are a lot of unknowns, first of all, and also all of this has to happen on like very small patches of property. And I think sometimes folks are hopeful that their properties might contain habitat that would be able to support Poweshiek or other endangered prairie butterflies. And sometimes private properties do have fairly viable habitat. So apart from sort of, if you do have habitat on your property, trying to keep it that way, yeah, that's really the only thing that I can think of, unfortunately. I wish I had a better answer. It's tricky with this project, yeah. But I appreciate the sentiment very much.
Well, I did just plant a lot of prairie dropseed last
yeah.
year. I was wondering, can you see any of this work at the zoo?
at the zoo.
Yeah. But
Those areas are not open to the public, but they do usually they'll do a sort of public event when they release adult butterflies. Like they'll have one day where they invite the public to come out and watch that happen. And I'm sure they'll be doing that again this summer, so you can look out for that. They'll probably post it on their website. They have a website where that just goes over their whole prairie butterfly conservation program. Yeah, I can provide the link if, yeah, okay. But yeah, they'll do usually a public day when they're doing the releases or around the time they're doing those. It's very cool to watch. Yeah.
Just to drop a seed, we had a speaker here talking about endangered species, and one of the slides showed the increase of wetland with Ducks Unlimited and the corresponding increase of wetland species. And I'm thinking, well, why haven't we started a Prairies Unlimited?
Yeah,
Like,
true.
a thought.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi, it's good there. You ended on a good note there with some good news. I don't know if you can answer this, but I'm kind of concerned of the fact that the Conservancy, which I know is a wonderful organization, I've contributed to them, but that they buy up prairie land and then they let it go to bush.
Yeah, I know, and they probably lament that more than anybody. It's, I know. It's just so tricky because
Yeah.
these trees and shrubs are just so competitive.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to implement a burn. And there's still so much we don't know about the effects of cattle grazing compared to bison. But even if you put bison in, it's just so different, obviously, than having a giant open plain where a herd of bison comes through every few years. Trying to put them in a little fence is never going to be the same. And then with their mowing efforts, they have ramped those up a lot in recent years. And we're kind of, the way that we think of the mowing is a bit more of a band-aid solution, in the sense that you can keep the shrubs and trees from encroaching quite easily compared to, for instance, trying to do a burn, which is so dependent on weather and those specific conditions in those specific years. You can do it obviously any time, which is good. The problem is if you don't do it repeatedly, I mean, you might know this, anything about willow or aspen, you cut them off, they'll just be like, well, then I'll put out 10 stems instead. But repeated mowing, and this is another that Jessica's looking at actually, is whether repeated mowing could have maybe the same effects as fire and grazing. But it's an ongoing struggle, and I think probably, again, no one is more stressed about that than the folks at the Nature Conservancy. I
didn't realize what we were getting into with
yeah. And you don't have to really, unlike shortgrass prairie, where it's just too dry for trees and shrubs, with tallgrass prairie, it is just particularly difficult. Because again, the only reason tallgrass prairie even existed ever is probably because of those frequent disturbances. It's got that moisture level where trees and shrubs can rapidly move in, and it only takes a few years, and you can get. Let's hope if something good comes of those drugs, that would be good. Yeah.
So there's another question in the chat. You kind of already addressed this, but ask anyway. If people wanted to grow plants to help in case of random Poweshiek population nearby, or if you have plants that you could add to their yards or local parks to encourage to grow something like that.
If there's a specific species, I mean, I am just a huge fan of prairie dropseed and little bluestem. I think they're amazing, and they can look gorgeous even in just flower beds, like raised beds. I would just, I'm actually a plant ecologist at heart, and so I would absolutely encourage people to grow those. Yes. In terms of whether Poweshiek could pop up in random locations that we don't know about, that is absolutely a possibility as well. We only have so many people who can go out and try to figure out where Poweshiek exists. Like, it is quite possible there are Poweshiek populations out there that we don't know about, because every summer It only flies for about 2 weeks, and that's the only time you can detect it. Trying to go around and find the caterpillars is never going to happen. They're like that long and the exact same color as a prairie grassseed. So we really only have 2 weeks to find them. And of course, we want to focus a lot of our efforts on the areas where we know they are so that we can track how their numbers are changing over time. And so we're always spread very thin, and it's always a bit of a juggle of like, oh, do we go out and look at this patch of prairie where they might be, but probably aren't, as opposed to like going to this patch where we know they are and we can track what their numbers are doing. And it's sort of difficult to divide ourselves up in a way where we can explore a lot of areas where they could. So yeah, all this to say that they could exist in places where we don't know about them. Yeah.
What are the 2-week intervals? Like when roughly are the 2 weeks that they're flying?
That does change from year to year. It depends on weather. But generally around the last week of June into early July is approximately when they'll be flying. Yeah. Oh, yeah. More audience questions. Love it.
Is there much like a collaboration going on with like groups in the States? Like, are you working together to work on stuff? And like, what are you doing together, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, again, really relevant right now because there's going to be a meeting with all of us in Minnesota in March. But unfortunately, I can't make it to in person because I'm teaching at the university. But everyone's going to get together from Canada and the States and sort of hash out where each of us are at. We also hold like monthly virtual meetings, which we just had one this morning. Was that this morning? Yeah, it was. That's a long time ago. Where basically we share what's working and what's not working, because they have similar captive rearing programs at I think 3 zoos now: the Minnesota Zoo, the John Ball Zoo, and I want to say there's one other one. And their number, I mean, they started doing that a little bit before we did, and they've got literally hundreds of individuals that they release every year, and they're looking to do their first reintroduction into a formerly occupied site this summer. So they've been picking our brains because we obviously just did that last summer, and we pick their brains about their captive rearing techniques. We're also talking to them right now about the best way to do sort of mark recapture studies to look at how the dispersal of those adults, because they've done a lot of work on that as well. So yeah, we're talking to them all the time, basically. They're a great bunch. They're awesome. Yeah.
Are there any destructive non-indigenous species that are coming in to those areas?
Yeah, that's another thing that I didn't get to mention, but the Nature Conservancy also really tries to keep on top of that. There are some patches of leafy spurge. Yeah, tell me about it. That are kind of taking, well, they've been able to prevent leafy spurge from really invading that southern group of habitat patches, but it's all along the ditches in there, and it's constantly trying to pop up in those sites. And then they have dedicated teams of summer interns who will go in and like literally pull them out by the roots. So they are keeping quite on top of that, actually, and been doing a fabulous job of that. Leafy spurge is probably the main one. There are other, I guess, European sort of asters and that kind of thing floating around that area that are a little bit less takeovery, for lack of a better term, than leafy spurge. So that's the one they've focused a lot on. But yeah, they keep very close tabs on that. So they're doing a great job.
Are there any other questions? All right, thank you very much, Nikki. You're so much fun to watch. You're so animated when you're interpreting. Thank you very much. It's a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you so much, Nikki. I hope that was somewhat intelligible. I wasn't talking too fast or anything.
And thank you, Dr. Dearborne, for a really interesting.
Oh, thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, and thank
My
you everyone
pleasure.
for coming out in this, braving this cold weather. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's take my mic.